The Glass Violin. Part 1. A short story by Misty Hamilton Smith. Copyright 2025. The parlor was a room of shadows. Curtains hung heavy across the tall windows, muting the daylight into a dim wash of grey. Dust drifted in slow spirals, catching faint glimmers where the light managed to slip through. The furniture seemed to sigh under its own weight. Chairs with sagging cushions, a table whose polish had dulled into memory, a rug worn thin by footsteps that no longer came. It was a room that held silence, not as absence, but as substance, thick and palpable, as if silence itself had taken residence there. In the far corner stood the violin, upright, unprotected. Its body gleamed faintly even in the dimness. It was made of glass, clear and delicate, its curves catching the light like frozen water. The scroll curled like a wave arrested mid-motion, and the strings, for threads of silver, stretched taut across the fragile body. No case enclosed it, no cloth covered it. It stood exposed, vulnerable, luminous, and untouchable. Elara had grown up with the violin as a constant presence. She could not remember a time when it had not been there, watching from its corner like a sentinel. As a child, she had tiptoed into the parlor, drawn by its shimmer, but each time she reached out, her mother's voice would call her back. "Not that one," her mother would say, with a tone that carried both warning and reverence. Her grandmother would add, "It breaks too easily." And her great-uncle, who had once been a musician, would simply shake his head, his eyes clouded with something she could not name. So the violin remained untouched. It was not forbidden, but it was feared. It was not hidden, but it was avoided. It became part of the room's silence, part of the house's memory, part of Elara's own childhood. She learned to walk past it without looking, to sit in the parlor without acknowledging it, to accept its presence as one accepts the presence of a portrait or a clock that no longer ticks. Yet the violin was not inert. On certain nights, when the wind pressed against the house and the curtains stirred, the strings would hum faintly, a sound like breath, like the whisper of a thought half-formed. Elara would lie awake in her room, listening, wondering if the house itself was speaking through the instrument. The sound was fragile, fleeting, but it carried a weight that made her heart race. She began to imagine that the violin was alive, that it was waiting, that it held within its glass body a voice that had not yet been released. She wondered why no one touched it, why no one dared to play it, why it had been left to stand in silence for so many years. She asked once, when she was small, and her grandmother's answer, "Because it breaks too easily," only deepened the mystery. What kind of music was so dangerous that it could shatter its own instrument? The parlor became a place of questions. Each time Elara entered, she felt the violin watching her, waiting for her, calling to her in a language she did not yet understand. The silence of the room pressed against her, but within that silence was a tension, a possibility, a promise. She began to feel that the violin was not merely an object, but a kind of test, a question posed by the house itself. Who will dare to touch me? Who will dare to listen? Elara did not yet have the answer. She only had the awareness, growing stronger each day, that the silent corner was not truly silent. It was a place where sound waited, fragile and luminous, ready to be born. She felt it pressing against her, not with urgency, but with patience, as though the violin knew she would return when the moment was right. That moment arrived with winter. Frost traced its own music across the windows, and the air inside the house grew sharp and expectant. Elara found herself drawn back to the parlor, her breath visible in the cold, her pulse quickening as though she were answering a summons. The violin gleamed faintly in its corner, crystalline and aloof, and for the first time she dared to step closer. She crossed the room slowly, each footfall muffled by the worn rug. The silence pressed against her, thick and expectant. She had never come this close before. The glass body shimmered, catching the faintest threads of light, and she felt a tremor in her chest. Not fear exactly, but the weight of possibility. Her hand hovered above the strings. She did not dare to touch them. Instead, she leaned forward, close enough that her breath fogged against the instrument's surface. She exhaled, a whisper of warmth against the cold glass. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, faintly, impossibly, the violin answered. It was a single note, fragile as dew, trembling in the air like a secret. Elara froze, her eyes wide, her heart hammering. The sound was not loud, not even clear, but it was unmistakably music. It hung in the silence, shimmering, before fading back into stillness. She stepped back, startled, her heel catching on the rug. The room seemed to hold its breath. Nothing shattered, nothing cracked. The violin stood unchanged, luminous and serene, as if it had merely sighed. But Elara felt something shift inside her. A door opening, a silence breaking, a promise whispered. She returned the next morning, and the morning after. Each time she came closer, each time she breathed against the strings, each time the violin gave her a note. Sometimes it was high and thin, sometimes low and trembling, sometimes barely audible, but always it was music, fragile and fleeting, like frost melting onto sunlight. She began to experiment. She brushed her fingertips lightly across the strings, coaxing faint vibrations. She hummed softly, letting her voice mingle with the instrument's fragile resonance. The violin seemed to respond, its notes weaving with hers, creating a dialogue of breath and sound. The parlor changed. The silence was no longer heavy. It was alive, filled with anticipation. The walls seemed to lean closer, the air to shimmer with possibility. Elara felt as though she had awakened something long dormant, something that had been waiting for her courage. And though the notes were fragile, though they vanished almost as soon as they were born, they carried a weight that filled her chest with wonder. She realized that the violin was not asking for mastery, not demanding perfection. It was asking for presence, for gentleness, for the willingness to listen. Thank you for listening to The Glass Violin. Part 1. The story continues with Part 2. Please make sure to follow and share.